These cottages on a headland at Robin Hood Bay on the east coast of England are a great drawing exercise to practice alignment and progressing subjects out in different directions. None of the shapes particularly are difficult, but there's a lot of them connected together in a fairly irregular way. So therefore it's a great exercise to just start in a place and move outwards. And it is also very forgiving, because if we end up having to make slight adjustments to buildings or elements or to leave things out, it's not really going to matter in the end, because it's the overall effect, the jumble of pieces that are placed together that makes sense, that creates the effect of the scene. It was interesting with the drawing experience looking back at the end, because at the start I realised, well, besides not positioning the camera properly, I realised that at the end, that at the start I was being too precious with it, too hesitant with my line work. I should have been somewhat bolder. Although I think the fact that my 0.2mm pen that I'm using here, I think either needs a nib change or some more ink, probably both. So I was struggling a bit just to find the physical lines from the pen I was wanting to have. But I did begin to get a bit bogged down with the detail. Although I like drawing detail, as you probably know, with a drawing at this scale, where the size of the objects physically that I'm drawing on the paper are very small, and where generally, at a glance, they're still relatively simple subjects, I do need, I think, to have an effective drawing to simplify. Otherwise, the objects end up being top-heavy with line work. Too much black for the amount of structure that there is. It's why scale is important when we draw. The size of what we're drawing on the paper versus the thickness of the line we're going to use for the effect we want and for the just sheer number of lines that we're going to have to use to capture the amount of detail that we want to draw. So I start centrally with this center roof, because then if I move out in all directions, if small errors accumulate, they won't accumulate as much in any one direction. And because this cottage is on the headland, and it has more detail in terms of windows and simple architectural elements, it is worth a little bit of a focus, even if I mess up one of its chimneys. But I trust there'll be enough detail at the end that that's not going to be obvious. I leave these windows that I've just drawn on this centre building for later when I use a 0.1mm pen, because I decide that for what I want to do, the 0.2 is going to be just too thick. And then there's the start of a hedge. The vegetation here is very important. It's why it's really worth working at developing a good style of drawing that's effective for capturing the effect of foliage, and not just of foliage in a generic sense, but of being able to capture different types of foliage, different bushes, different shrubs, different trees. Because the foliage in this scene is, I think, a large part of the effect and the setting of the scene. It's this foliage that reinforces that we're on a slope, we're on a hill, which is important, I think, for the overall feel of the drawing. But the foliage also has a sense of the rural nature of this scene. These houses are all clinging together on a rocky headland, but there's natural landscape coming up all to it, all around. The bushes, the shrubs, they're also unkept. They are growing wild. So we want to capture that feeling too, which again brings a sense of the fairly wild nature of this part of the coast. and of the experience, I imagine, of living here exposed to the elements in this way. But because so much of the scene is taken up with the foliage, we do want to make sure that we capture the effect of individual bushes and shrubs, but also that we create interesting lines, that we create some sort of visual disentanglement in what we draw, but also some lines and angles of line, marks and values coming into each other that create interesting shapes. And of course, the marks that we make for the foliage are going to be very different to the marks we make for the houses. So there's going to be this great contrast between the upper half and the lower half, just visually as well. So it's really worth working at drawing foliage and creating a confident, effective way to do it. Now, it's about this stage that I consciously think I've just become way too precious with this, and I need to pick up the pace and draw more briskly, because it's just becoming a little too intense, what I'm drawing, a little too almost self-conscious, which I think leads to drawings looking overdrawn. So I decide to lighten things up and go a bit faster, because I'm also aware that while the shrubs aren't perhaps as demanding for precision as the buildings, they will still take a fair bit of time to draw. Now, you're watching this at double speed, so this took me 25 minutes to draw, which I must admit was a bit longer than I thought, although I also must admit, surprisingly enough, I do tend to underestimate the time it takes to draw foliage. It's simple enough in some ways once we have a confident style to use, but it still just takes time to put the sheer number of marks on the paper that we need to create the effect of the foliage that we want. So, but I also spent too long on those first few buildings, so I really am picking up the pace. I feel like I get a lot more done. I wish I'd started the drawing at this stage. So there's just a few buildings left, just a couple of roofs at the top here. And then we get to be serious about the foliage, not just where it touches the buildings that we were drawing. Just having a quick look to see if there's anything else that I'm wanting to do. Some hint of the tiling. I feel like I need to do some indication of texture and construction, and yet I want the overall outlines of the buildings to be the main thing. I don't want them to become a massive pattern, which is always the danger in this sort of scene, because the pattern in the texture is not as obvious as the simple outlines of the buildings when we look at the scene. And that's what I'd like to still capture in what I do. Now, I've picked up my 0.1 and I'm doing these windows with a lighter touch, trying to maintain the effect that we have in life. And now I'm feeling a bit under the time, or over the time, in fact, there's a better way of putting it. I think I was thinking under the pump. So there's a tree that comes up from closer to us on the lower right, and then the rest of it is really shrubs. So I have switched to a 0.3mm pen because firstly it'll be quicker to create some of the darker values I want to create in this, but also all of these shrubs and the trees are closer to us, significantly closer to us than the buildings. So it also, to use a heavier, stronger line, helps us to create the effect of closeness and therefore of furtherness, and establish a nice depth of plane from foreground to probably just midground. There's not as deeper plane here as in many scenes I draw. And so I'm trying to work out the general lines of this. I want to make sure I create places where the brain can pause and see different elements, either different shrubs or closer ones, overlapping with what we see of ones further behind them. So that it's not just a visual mess, some sort of lineal tangle. And there are some flowers. I do some dots to try and represent the flowers. Whether we read them as flowers or not, we at least read them as a different type of surface, which I think is the main thing. And sometimes I'm doing the hatching to indicate the shade and the shadow of the shrubs, and other times I'm doing it to indicate the colour as well. And I think in this sort of context, in the end, it's best to make choices that give our drawing interest and clarity rather than being necessarily faithful to the reference. This tree on the right-hand side is a bit of a challenge compared to the other more shrubby foliage. I greatly simplify the stairs, which was, I think, the best decision I made with the whole drawing. And here's the sea, which we don't actually see in this reference. That's the top of the photo. But I thought to put a line to represent the horizon was to capture something of the reality of the location, the position of the view. Of course, this photo will be on my channel community page if you'd like to have a go referencing and spacing out and just plotting adjacent shapes of a scene such as this. It's at the bottom of a very long, steep hill to get to, which means it's a long, steep walk out of at the end. But Robin Hood Bay is certainly worth a visit if you're ever on the northeast coast of England. So, looking at this, I think we're pretty close to being done. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Well, besides being a great memory of a morning on the English coast, this is a great scene to draw. So look, I hope you give it a go and just find out where you sit when you try and strike the balance between the amount of detail that you draw and the amount that you leave. But also organising all the shapes and in the end, not having a tangle, but having a cohesive scene. So I hope you give it a go. But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it and however it turns out, I hope you have fun. See you next time. Bye.